Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. This is my first ever Mark Twain conference, so I'm so honored to be here among all these titans in the field. I'm kind of pinching myself. The title of my talk today is Extinction in the Smoke Clouds of the Stake, Evolution and the Ecogothic in Mark Twain's Joan of Arc. This is slightly different than what the abstract says in the program. The topic kind of evolved, for lack of a better word, but that topic that's in the abstract is also a developing project. I just got sidetracked. So I'd like to begin this presentation with an image. Mark Twain, flanked by steel magnate Andrew Carnegie and famed American naturalist Dan Beard, stands to receive a crown of laurels from a costumed figure of Joan of Arc. This photograph first appeared in the New York Times on December 31st, 1905, 9 years after the publication of Twain's novel, Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc. As the man who coined the phrase, the Gilded Age, Twain was acutely attuned to the scientific, political, and industrial crises of this period, and often wove such concerns into his literary works. At the turn of the century, America continued to experience rapid economic growth and industrialization while also entering an era of conservation, spearheaded by President Teddy Roosevelt's establishment of national parks, forests, and reserves. The U.S. Forest Service was officially established in 1905, the same year that this photograph was taken. Despite the fact that at the turn of the century, Twain was, quote, hobnobbing uneasily with millionaires like Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller Sr., end quote, those are Ann Douglas's words, he critiqued the millionaires who engrossed portions of America's resources, land, furs, oil, and coal. This odd photograph allows us to visualize how a novel like Joan of Arc, despite its medieval literary setting, may be standing at the very heart of turn-of-the-century industrial and environmental concerns. In this paper, I argue that an eco-Gothic reading of Mark Twain's Joan of Arc can illuminate the evolutionary and environmental rhetoric embedded within the novel. While critics have long observed that Joan's character is intimately linked with nature and natural imagery, these readings usually describe Joan as a pastoral figure, a reinvention of the mythical shepherdess persona. Such an interpretation overlooks the ecological anxiety that also permeates this text. In the prefatory note to the novel, the narrator, Sieur Louis de Conte, describes Joan's death as the spectacle of the marvelous child's meteor flight across the war firmament of France and its extinction in the smoke clouds of the stake. The use of the word extinction here, I argue, calls to mind Darwin's On the Origin of Species, which was published in 1859, just a few decades before Joan of Arc's 1896 publication. Rarity, writes Darwin, is the precursor to extinction, and I contend that Twain depicts Joan as a biological anomaly, a rare species destined for extinction. We know that Twain read Darwin with interest, and critics have traced Darwin's influence on other Twain novels, including Huckleberry Finn. Yet despite the evolutionary language that characterizes some of Twain's writings on Joan of Arc, no significant Darwinian or eco-critical reading of this novel has yet been attempted. I begin by laying the historical groundwork for my reading, drawing upon sources that highlight how Twain is engaging with concerns brought on by Darwin's theory leading up to the publication of Joan of Arc. Next, I situate my argument within the burgeoning field of eco-Gothic scholarship to provide a theoretical scaffolding for my claims. As Bridget Marshall notes, the eco-Gothic is not so much a genre as a literary mode, a skeleton that sits in the closet of a text and signifies a sense of unease about narratives of human progress in light of humanity's deteriorating relationship with the natural world. Throughout his novel, Twain fuses ecological, evolutionary language with religious, traditionally Gothic themes to create such a sense of unease. Ultimately, I posit that tracing these eco-Gothic moments can also lend a fresh perspective on Twain's conflicted treatment of Joan's Catholicism in the novel, an inconsistency that has long haunted critical conversations about this text. Evolution was certainly on Twain's mind during the period when he composed Joan of Arc. In the years leading up to the novel's 1896 publication, his writings repeatedly mention Darwin's theory of evolution. Moreover, these references to Darwin are often linked with the nation of France, a pairing which initially seems like an odd coincidence, but in fact foreshadows Twain's evolutionary language in Joan of Arc. Just a few years before the publication of Joan of Arc, Twain expressed what Justin Kaplan, in his Oxford University Press introduction to the novel, has referred to as an almost pathological aversion to France and the French. In an unpublished sketch from A Tramp Abroad, for example, Twain calls the French the connecting link between man and monkey, saying that, quote, a favorite pastime with the French from time immemorial has been the burning and slaughtering of each other, making them somehow less than human, more animal-like. Citing this passage, Kaplan emphasizes how ironic it is that Twain would choose an avatar of French nationalism as the heroine of his novel, given his apparent disdain for the country. Yet this quotation is interesting for another reason. It reveals that Twain associates the French nation with an evolutionary metaphor, the link between man and monkey. Twain's use of the word link here evokes the concept of a missing link, a term that describes transitional forms between species in an evolutionary series. Scientists in the late 19th century sought to find fossils that could link humans with their primate ancestors. Given the topic's coverage in news media, Twain was quite familiar with missing link terminology. One article published in the Philadelphia Inquirer on February 3, 1895, recounts the discovery of such a specimen. The report tells the story of Dr. Eugene Dubois, who during his time stationed in Java, Indonesia, uncovered Java Man, a fossil we now know as Homo erectus. Java Man is described by the article as evidence for the theory of evolution and for the descent of man from some prehistoric animal akin to the modern monkey. Thus, when Twain calls the French the connecting link between man and monkey, his language resembles articles written about Java Man, a fossil discovered a year before the publication of Joan of Arc. This association is reiterated in Twain's essay titled Man's Place in the Animal World, published the same year as Joan of Arc. In this satirical essay, Twain recounts that he has been scientifically studying the difference between the lower animals, so-called, and the traits and dispositions of man. As a result of his research, he has been compelled to renounce his allegiance to the Darwinian theory of the ascent of man from the lower animals. Instead, he now believes in a new and truer theory, that of the descent of man from the higher animals. What sets man apart, Twain explains, is his cruelty, his indecency, vulgarity, obscenity. These are strictly confined to men. He invented them. Among the higher animals, there is no trace of them. Indulging in a bit of convoluted reasoning, Twain argues that all of these flaws in human nature are the result of one great defect, the moral sense. Man's sense of what is morally right enables him to do what is wrong. This essay is characteristically tongue-in-cheek. Nevertheless, it displays Twain intentionally distorting Darwin's theory of evolution in order to make critical observations about human nature. His claim that humanity has descended morally from the rest of the animal kingdom also includes a dig at the French. I really apologize to any French people here. And so I find that we have descended and degenerated from some far ancestor, some microscopic atom, insect by insect, animal by animal, reptile by reptile, till we have reached the bottom stage of development, nameable as the human being. Below us, nothing but the Frenchman. There's only one possible stage below the moral sense. That is the immoral sense. The Frenchman has it. It appears that for Twain, the last missing link in this evolutionary series might be located not in Java, Indonesia, but rather in France, the place where the moral sense in humankind has deteriorated one step further, to the immoral sense. This, then, is Twain's moralizing spin on Darwin's theory, and it serves as a backdrop against which we can read and interpret the figure of Joan of Arc. Now I will highlight just two aspects of Ecogothic literary theory that render it a fitting lens for my presentation. Crucial to my argument is Kelly Hurley's claim that Darwin's evolutionary theories elicited a radical rethinking of humanity's position relative to the environment in the second half of the 19th century. Narratives inspired by Darwin rendered the identity of the human body and its distinctness from the brute beasts unstable. Some public figures concluded that humanity had come into existence through a random combination of natural processes, and nature was ethically neutral and under no compulsion to privilege the human species. We can see how the horrifying opening image of Twain's Joan of Arc, which describes wolves eating dead bodies on the streets of Paris, captures this sense of nature as neutral and non-anthropocentric. Another key hallmark of Ecogothic theory is the significance of the forest, or the deep, dark woods, in American literature, especially as articulated by Keatley and Sybils, and more recently Elizabeth Parker. Keatley and Sybils challenged the idea that America's environmental imagination chiefly originated from the pastoral, anthropocentric view of the transcendentalists. Instead, they seek to expose the darker aspects of the human cultural relationship with the North American natural world. In Twain's Joan of Arc, the forest is not a mere backdrop against which all human action unfolds. Rather, nature is foregrounded. The narrative repeatedly exemplifies the eco-Gothic conceit of the living forest, a forest that embodies the contempt and fear we feel for the agency of the natural environment. Significantly, Joan receives her divine revelations in the middle of the woods, beside the fairy tree of Domremy. By identifying his protagonist with the living forest, Twain is able to depict Joan as a rare species who goes extinct through anthropogenic causes. Eventually, she is cut off and burned like firewood, destroyed in the same way that a tree would be destroyed. Throughout Joan of Arc, Twain repeatedly uses evolutionary language, suggesting that Joan is the final survivor of a rare species. However, even though Twain surrounds Joan with evolutionary rhetoric, he ultimately portrays a heroine who cannot be contained within the language of science. I've already quoted the preface in which the narrator speaks of Joan of Arc's extinction at the stake. A similar example occurs in the novel when he narrates, "When we reflect that Joan's century was the brutalest, the wickedest, the rottenest in history since the darkest ages, we are lost in wonder at the miracle of such a product from such a soil." Plant and soil imagery permeate the text. Joan is later called blameless as the very flowers in the fields and a clay-made girl. But she is linked with non-human animals as well. During her imprisonment, the narrator tells us that Joan was an out-of-doors creature by nature, but now she was shut up day and night in a steel cage like an animal. Twain's blurring of the human and non-human in these passages render Joan of Arc an eco-Gothic figure. But Twain also connects Joan with more explicit scientific language. He does so primarily through the narrator, who engages in anachronistic digressions on whether scientific evidence can be trusted. When referring to a dragon that may or may not have haunted the forest near Domremy, for example, de Conte remarks that no one had ever seen it, it was only an opinion. His lengthy, complicated distinction between opinions versus evidence incorporates language that evokes fossilized remains. There is no sense in forming an opinion when there is no evidence to form it on. If you build a person without any bones in him, he may look fair enough to the eye, but he will be limber and cannot stand up, and I consider that evidence is the bones of an opinion. A few lines later, in reference to the dragon's smell that allegedly lingered in the forest even after a priest abolished the local dragon, de Conte gives a similar caveat. Not that any had ever smelt the smell again, for none had. It was only an opinion like any other, and lacked bones, you see. Reading Twain's words, though placed in the narrative voice of a 15th century Frenchman, we too ought to detect a certain smell, a whiff of Darwin's theory of evolution. Twain and his contemporaries, like the author of that Philadelphia Inquirer article about Java Man, knew that evolutionists were still engaged in the process of bringing up tangible proofs of the existence of the continuous series of living organisms. Here, de Conte's repeated digressions on the nature of hard, solid evidence serve as an extended evolutionary metaphor about the story of Joan herself. Why, he seems to ask, should we take his account seriously? Why treat his personal recollections as evidence rather than opinion? Clearly, there are aspects of Joan's narrative that cannot be explained by scientific evidence alone, yet Twain never fully resolves this tension. Thus far, I've argued for an ecological and evolutionary reading of the text, but how specifically does the eco-Gothic function here? This is where we must put some distance between the narrator, Sieur Louis de Conte, and Joan's executioners, the priests and politicians who condemn her to be burned at the stake. For de Conte, Joan's identification with nature, her shared affinity with plants and animals is altogether positive, a sign of her innocence and goodness. For her enemies, however, her connection to nature is a sign of evil and possibly witchcraft. To illustrate this, let us turn again to the fairy tree, that mystical beech tree where Joan first hears her voices. The woods near Joan's village are described as deep and gloomy and dense. Even after the dragon is banished, some believe that fairies inhabit the forest, especially the fairy tree. It is under this tree that Joan receives her visions, a detail that her enemies harp on while trying to convict her, since they believe it is proof of demonic activity. Susan K. Harris has noted that the historical record of Joan of Arc does suggest that some kind of tree played a part in a minor nature cult in the lives of Domremy villagers during Joan's childhood. But Twain truly makes this tree the epicenter of the novel in a way that the historical records don't quite corroborate. In other words, Twain closely links Joan's eventual conviction and execution to her relationship with the fairy tree. To her persecutors, Joan is an Ecogothic body who blurs and destabilizes the boundary between human and non-human, such that she threatens the established social and religious order and must be expelled from society. This is evident in an early chapter of the text when Joan reproaches the priest of Domremy for exorcising the fairies who used to dwell beside the tree. Though she uses quite sophisticated legal language throughout this passage, Joan's failed defense of the fairies foreshadows her own banishment and execution. The priest feigns remorse for what he has done, saying that he will put on sackcloth and ashes in atonement for banishing the fairies. Yet he urges Joan to put the ashes on his head for him, a profanation that Joan refuses to do out of respect for the man's priesthood. Instead, Joan deluges her own head with the ashes, stammering out through her chokings and suffocations, "There, now it is done. Oh, please get up, Father." The Christ-like resonances are clear. Joan takes upon herself the sins of the priest, and even her words, "Now it is done," echo the last words of Christ on the cross, "It is finished." This humble martyrdom of ashes, as the priest calls it a few lines later, prefigures Joan's eventual burning at the stake. It also implies that the sin for which Joan must atone, symbolized by the priest's banishment of the fairies at the fairy tree, is the rupturing of the bond between humans and the natural world. Bridget Marshall notes that while Romantic literature typically portrays idyllic pastoral scenes, Gothic literature complicates such Edenic imagery with an understanding of the fallen world. Though Twain's Joan of Arc bears certain similarities with Romantic pastoral heroines, the narrator's use of evolutionary language undermines any Edenic connotations. Joan's extinction represents the degree to which humanity has already ruined its relationship with the natural world. Eco-Gothic readings often reveal that what is inhumane and pitiless in a text is not so much the natural world, but rather its destruction by human undertakings. True to form, the horror in Joan's tragedy stems not from the deep, dark woods that constitute the source of her power, but rather the cruelty of her human executioners. With the death of Joan, the moral sense in humankind has deteriorated one step further, to the immoral sense. By interpreting Joan as an Eco-Gothic figure, we can understand how Twain carefully distances Joan both from strict scientific evidence and from her Catholic identity. This is exemplified in the moments leading up to her execution, when Joan asks for a cross. Eventually, a consecrated crucifix is brought out of a nearby church for her, but Joan first venerates a makeshift cross fashioned out of 2 broken pieces of wood. Since Twain does not distinguish between the cross of broken wood and the crucifix in subsequent pages, it remains unclear whether the cross she venerates at the end of her life is the natural cross or the consecrated one. This final ambiguity underscores Twain's project. Joan's existence cannot be neatly categorized in scientific or religious terms. In the words of Twain's 1897 essay, "It is beyond us. All the rules fail in this girl's case. In the world's history, she stands alone, quite alone." Thank you.